Hello, fifth graders. So we left off in the tale of Despereaux at the point where Despereaux fell in love with Princess P. His brother saw him at the foot of the king with the princess patting his head and went and told his father and mother, and his father decided to bring together the council who determines what is best for the mouse community. And I had you think about, okay, if Despereaux's own father thinks he should be punished, what do you think is going to happen because of this mouse council meeting? So now we are on page 37, chapter 7, A Mouse in Love. And what was our own favorite member of the mouse community doing while the sound of the mouse council drum echoed through the walls of the castle? Reader, I must report that Threadmaster had not seen the worst of it. Despereaux sat with the princess and the king and listened to song after song. At one point, gently, oh so gently, the pea picked up the mouse in her hand. She cupped him in her palm and scratched his oversized ears. You have lovely ears, the pea said to him. They are like small pieces of velvet. If you've ever pet a cat's ears before, they're really soft. I imagine that's how Despereaux's ears feel. Despereaux thought that he might faint with the pleasure of someone referring to his ears as small and lovely. He laid his tail against the pea's wrist to steady himself, and he felt the princess's pulse, the pounding of her heart, and his own heart immediately took up the rhythm of hers. Papa, the pea said when the music was over, I am going to keep this mouse. We are going to be great friends. The king looked at Despereaux, cupped in his daughter's hands. He narrowed his eyes. A mouse, he muttered. A rodent. What? Said the pea. Put it down, the king commanded. No, said the pea, who was a person not at all used to being told what to do. I mean, why should I? Because I told you to. But why? Protested the pea. Because it's a mouse. I know, I'm the one who told you he was a mouse. I wasn't thinking, said the king. Thinking of what? Your mother, the queen. My mother, said the pea sadly. Mice are rodents, said the king. He adjusted his crown. They are related to rats. You know how we feel about rats. You know of our own dark history with rats. The pea shuddered. But Papa, she said, he is not a rat. He is a mouse. There's a difference. Royalty, the king said, has many responsibilities, and one of them is not becoming involved personally with even the distant relatives of one's enemies. Put him down, Pea. The princess put Despereaux down. Good girl, said the king, and then he looked at Despereaux. Scat, he said. Despereaux, however, did not scat. He sat and stared up at the princess. The king stamped his foot. Scat, he shouted. Papa, said the princess, please don't be mean to him, and she began to weep. Despereaux, seeing her tears, broke the last of the great ancient rules of mice. He spoke to a human. Please, said Despereaux, don't cry. He held out his handkerchief to the princess. The pea sniffled and leaned down close to him. Do not speak to her, thundered the king. Despereaux dropped his handkerchief. He backed away from the king. Rodents do not speak to princesses. We will not have this becoming a topsy-turvy, wrong-headed world. There are rules. Scat, get lost before my common sense returns and I have you killed. The king stamped his foot again. Despereaux found it alarming to have such a big foot brought down with so much force and anger so close to his own small head. He ran toward the hole in the wall. But he turned before he entered it. He turned and shouted to the princess, My name is Despereaux. Despereaux, she said. I honor you, shouted Despereaux. I honor you, was what the knight said to the fair maiden in the story that Despereaux read every day in the book in the library. Despereaux had muttered the phrase often to himself, but he had never before this evening had occasion to use it when speaking to someone else. Get out of here, shouted the king, stamping his foot harder and then harder still, so it seemed as if the whole castle, the very world, were shaking. Rodents know nothing of honor. Despereaux ran into the hole, and from there he looked out at the princess. She had picked up his handkerchief, and she was looking at him, right directly into his soul. Despereaux, she said. He saw his name on her lips. I honor you, whispered Despereaux. I honor you. He put his paw over his heart. He bowed so low that his whiskers touched the floor. He was, alas, a mouse deeply in love. Chapter 8. To the Rats. The Mouse Council. 13 honored mice and the one most very honored head mouse heeded the call of Lester's drum and gathered in a small secret hole of King Philip's throne room. The 14 mice sat around a piece of wood balanced on spools of thread and listened in horror while Despereaux's father related the story of what Threadmaster had seen. At the foot of the king, said Lester. Her finger right on top of his head, said Lester. He was looking up at her, and it was not in fear. The Mouse Council members listened with their mouths open. They listened with their whiskers drooping and their ears flat against their heads. They listened in dismay and outrage and fear. When Lester finished, there was a silence dismal and deep. Something, intoned the most very honored head mouse, is wrong with your son. He is not well. This goes beyond his fevers, beyond his large ears and his lack of growth. He is deeply disturbed. His behavior endangers us all. Humans cannot be trusted. We know this to be an indisputable fact. A mouse who consorts with humans. A mouse who would sit right at the foot of a man. A mouse who would allow a human to touch him. And here the entire Mouse Council indulged in a collective shiver of disgust. Cannot be trusted. That is the way of the world, our world. Fellow mice, it is my most fervent hope that Despereaux has not spoken to these humans, but obviously we can assume nothing, and this is a time to act, not wonder. Lester nodded his head in agreement, and the 12 other members of the Mouse Council nodded their heads too. We have no choice, said the head mouse. He must go to the dungeon. He pounded his fisted paw on the table. He must go to the rats. Immediately, members of the council, I will now ask you to vote. Those in favor of Despereaux being sent to the dungeon say aye. There was a chorus of sad ayes. Those opposed say nay. Silence reigned in the room. The only noise came from Lester. He was crying. And 13 mice, ashamed for Lester, looked away. Reader, can you imagine your own father not voting against your being sent to a dungeon full of rats? Can you imagine him not saying one word in your defense? I want you guys to think about that. How would that make you feel if your own father wanted to send you to jail? Despereaux's father wept, and the most very honored head mouse beat his paw against the table again and said, Despereaux Tilling will appear before the mouse community. He will hear of his sins. He will be given a chance to deny them. If he does not deny them, he will be allowed to renounce them so that he may go to the dungeon with a pure heart. Despereaux Tilling is hereby called to sit with the Mouse Council. At least Lester had the decency to weep at his act of perfidy. Reader, do you know what perfidy means? I have a feeling you do, based on the little scene that has just unfolded here, but you should look up the word in your dictionary, just to be sure. So, if we go and we look up the word perfidy, it's deceitfulness or untrustworthiness. So, and I think we can agree that Despereaux's dad is being deceitful and untrustworthy with how he acted. Chapter 9. The Right Question. The Mouse Council sent Threadmaster to collect Despereaux, and Threadmaster found his brother in the library standing on top of the great open book, his tail wrapped tightly around his feet, his small body shivering. Despereaux was reading the story out loud to himself. He was reading from the beginning so that he could get to the end, where the reader was assured that the knight and the fair maiden lived happily ever after. Despereaux wanted to read those words, happily ever after. He needed to say them aloud. He needed some assurance that this feeling he had for the Princess P, this love, would come to a good end, and so he was reading the story as if it were a spell, and the words of it, spoken aloud, could make magic happen. See here, said Threadmaster out loud to himself. He looked at his brother and then looked away. This is just the kind of thing I'm talking about. This is exactly the kind of thing. What's he doing here, for cripe's sake? He's not eating the paper. He's talking to the paper. It's wrong, wrong, wrong. Hey, he said to Despereaux. Despereaux kept reading. Hey, shouted Furlough. Despereaux! The Mouse Council wants you. Pardon? Said Despereaux. He looked up from the book. The Mouse Council has called you to sit with them. Me? Said Despereaux. You. I'm busy right now, said Despereaux, and he bent his head again to open the book. Furlough sighed. Geez, he said. Cripes. Nothing makes sense to this guy. Nothing. I was right to turn him in. He's sick. Furlough crawled up the chair leg and then hopped onto the book. He sat next to Despereaux. He tapped him on the head. Once, twice. Hey, he said. The Mouse Council isn't asking, they're telling. They're commanding. You have to come with me right now. Despereaux turned to Furlough. Do you know what love is? He said. Huh? Love. Furlough shook his head. You're asking the wrong question, he said. The question you should be asking is why the Mouse Council wants to see you. There is somebody who loves me, said Despereaux, and I love her, and that is the only thing that matters to me. Somebody who loves you? Somebody who you love? What difference does that make? What matters is that you're in a lot of trouble with the Mouse Council. Her name, said Despereaux, is P. What? The person who loves me, her name is P. Cripes, said Furlough. You're missing the whole point of everything here. You're missing the point of being a mouse. You're missing the point of being called to sit with the Mouse Council. You've got to come with me. It's the law. You've been called. Despereaux sighed. He reached out and touched the words fair maiden in the book. He traced them with one paw, and then he put his paw to his mouth. Cripes, said Furlough. You're making a fool of yourself. Let's go. I honor you, whispered Despereaux. I honor you. And then, reader, he followed Furlough over the book and down the chair leg and across the library floor to the waiting Mouse Council. He allowed his brother to lead him to his fate. Chapter 10. Good Reasons. The entire mouse community, as instructed by the most very honored head mouse, had gathered behind the wall of the castle ballroom. The members of the Mouse Council sat atop 3 bricks piled high, and spread out before them was every mouse, old and young, foolish and wise, who lived in the castle. They were all waiting for Despereaux. Make way, said Furlough. Here he is. I've got him. Make way. Furlough pushed through the crowd of mice. Despereaux clung to his brother's tail. There he is, the mice whispered. There he is. He's so small. They say he was born with his eyes open. Some of the mice pulled away from Despereaux in disgust, and others, thrill-seekers, reached out to touch him with a whisker or a paw. The princess put a finger on him. They say he sat at the foot of the king. It is simply not done, came the distinctive voice of Despereaux's Aunt Florence. Make way, shouted Furlough. I have him right here. I have Despereaux Tilling, who has been called to sit with the Mouse Council. He led Despereaux to the front of the room. Honored members of the Mouse Council, shouted Furlough, I have brought you Despereaux Tilling as you requested to sit with you. He looked over his shoulder at Despereaux. Let go of me, Furlough said. Despereaux dropped Furlough's tail. He looked up at the members of the Mouse Council. His father met his gaze and then shook his head and looked away. Despereaux turned and faced the sea of mice. To the dungeon, a voice cried out. Straight to the dungeon with him. Despereaux's head, which had been full of such delightful phrases as happily ever after and lovely ears and I honor you, suddenly cleared. Straight to the dungeon, another voice shouted. Enough, said the most very honored head mouse. This trial will be conducted in an orderly fashion. We will act civilized. He cleared his throat. He said to Despereaux, Son, turn and look at me. Despereaux turned. He looked up and into the head mouse's eyes. They were dark eyes, deep and sad and frightened, and looking into them, Despereaux's heart thudded once, twice. Despereaux Tilling, said the head mouse. Yes, sir, said Despereaux. We, the 14 members of the Mouse Council, have discussed your behavior. First, we will give you a chance to defend yourself against these rumors of your egregious acts. There we go. Yes. Did you, or did you not, sit at the foot of the human king? I did, said Despereaux, but I was listening to the music, sir. I was there to hear the song that the king was singing. To hear the what? The song, sir. He was singing a song about the deep purple falling over sleepy garden walls. The head mouse shook his head. Whatever you are talking about is beside the point. The question is this and only this. Did you sit at the foot of the human king? I did, sir. The community of mice shifted their tails and paws and whiskers. They waited. And did you allow the girl human, the princess, to touch you? Her name is P. Never mind her name. Did you allow her to touch you? Yes, sir, said Despereaux. I let her touch me. It felt good. A gasp arose from the assembled mice. Despereaux heard his mother's voice. Mon Dieu, it is not the end of the world. It was a touch. What of it? It is simply not done, came Aunt Florence's voice from the crowd. To the dungeons, said a mouse in the front row. Silence, roared the most very honored head mouse. Silence. He looked down at Despereaux. Do you, Despereaux Tilling, understand the sacred, never-to-be-broken rules of conduct for being a mouse? Yes, sir, said Despereaux. I guess so, but did you break them? Yes, sir, said Despereaux. He raised his voice. But I broke the rules for good reasons, because of music and because of love. Love, said the head mouse. Oh, cripes, said Furlough. Here we go. I love her, sir, said Despereaux. We are not here to talk about love. This trial is not about love. This trial is about you being a mouse, shouted the most very honored head mouse from high atop the bricks, and not acting like one. Yes, sir, said Despereaux, I know. No, I don't think that you do know, and because you do not deny the charges, you must be punished. You are to be sent, as ancient castle mouse law decrees, to the dungeon. You are being sent to the rats. That's right, shouted a mouse in the crowd. That's the ticket. The dungeon? The rats? Despereaux's small heart sank all the way to the tip of his tail. There would be no light in the dungeon, no stained glass windows, no library and no books. There would be no Princess P. But first, said the most very honored head mouse, we will give you the chance to renounce your actions. We will allow you to go to the dungeon with a pure heart. Renounce? Repent. Say that you are sorry you sat at the foot of the human king. Say that you are sorry you allowed the human princess to touch you. Say that you regret these actions. Despereaux felt hot and then cold and then hot again. Renounce her? Renounce the princess? Mon Dieu, shouted his mother. Son, do not act the fool. Renounce, repent. What say you, Despereaux Tilling? I say, no, whispered Despereaux. What? Said the head mouse. No, said Despereaux, and this time he did not whisper the word. I am not sorry. I will not renounce my actions. I love her. I love the princess. There was a bellow of collective outrage. The whole of the mouse community surged toward Despereaux. The mice seemed to become one angry body with hundreds of tails and thousands of whiskers, and one huge hungry mouth opening and closing and opening and closing, saying over and over and over again, To the dungeon! To the dungeon! To the dungeon! The words pounded through Despereaux's body with each beat of his heart. Very well, said the most very honored head mouse. You will die then with a black heart. Threadmaster, he called, bring out the thread. Despereaux marveled at his own bravery. He admired his own defiance. And then, reader, he fainted. Chapter 11. The Threadmaster Cometh. When Despereaux came to, he heard the drum. His father was beating a rhythm that had much more boom and much less tat. Together, Lester and the drum produced an ominous sound that went something like this. Boom, 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 tat. Boom, 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 tat. Make way for the thread, cried a mouse who was pushing a wooden spool of red thread through the crowd. Make way for the thread. Boom, 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 tat, went the drum. To the dungeon, shouted the mice. Despereaux lay on his back, blinking his eyes. How, he wondered, had things gone so terribly wrong? Wasn't it a good thing to love? In the story in the book, love was a very good thing, because the knight loved the fair maiden, he was able to rescue her. They lived happily ever after. It said so. In the book, they were the last words on the page, happily ever after. Despereaux was certain that he had read exactly those words time and time again. Lying on the floor with the drum beating and the mice shouting, the Threadmaster calling out, "Make way, make way!" Despereaux had a sudden chilling thought. Had some other mouse eaten the words that spoke the truth? Did the knight and the fair maiden really not live happily ever after? Reader, do you believe that there is such a thing as happily ever after? Or, like Despereaux, have you too begun to question the possibility of happy endings? I want you to think about that. Is happily ever after a true thing? What do you think? And why do you think that? Happily ever after, whispered Despereaux. Happily ever after, he said again, as a spool of thread came to a stop beside him. The thread, the thread, the thread, murmured the mice. I'm sorry, said the mouse behind the spool, but I have to ask you to stand up. I have to do my job. Despereaux got slowly to his feet. On your hind legs, please, said the Threadmaster. It's the rules. Despereaux stood on his hind legs. Thank you, said the mouse. I appreciate it. While Despereaux watched, the Threadmaster unwound a length of red thread from the spool and tied a loop. Just enough for the neck, muttered the mouse. No more, no less. That's what the last Threadmaster taught me. Enough thread for the neck. He looked up at Despereaux and then back down at the loop of thread. And you, my friend, have a small neck. The Threadmaster raised his arms and put them around Despereaux's neck. He leaned in close as Despereaux smelled celery. And Despereaux smelled celery. He could feel the Threadmaster's breath in his ear as he worked at tightening the thread. Is she beautiful? The Threadmaster whispered. What? Said Despereaux. Shh, is the princess beautiful? The Princess P? Yes. She is lovely beyond all imagining, said Despereaux. Just right, the Threadmaster said. He drew back. He nodded his head. A lovely princess just so, like a fairy tale. And you love her, as a knight loves a maiden. You love her with a courtly love, a love that is based on bravery and courtesy and honor and devotion. Just so. How do you know that? Despereaux said. How do you know about fairy tales? Shh! The mouse leaned in close, and Despereaux smelled celery again, green and alive. Be brave, friend, whispered the Threadmaster. Be brave for the princess. And then he stepped back and turned and shouted, Fellow mice, the thread has been tied. The thread has been knotted. A roar of approval went up from the crowd. Despereaux squared his shoulders. He had made a decision. He would do as the Threadmaster had suggested. He would be brave for the princess. Even if, reader, could it be true, there was no such thing as happily ever after. So we can see on page 60, the Threadmaster tying the thread. So just enough for the neck, muttered the mouse. No more, no less. Chapter 12. Adieu. The sound of the drum changed again. The final tat disappeared and became nothing but boom. Boom, boom, boom. Boom, boom, boom. Lester used only his tail, bringing it down with great force and seriousness upon the drum. The Threadmaster retreated. You guys think of that. Your father holding the drum that's encouraging this. That's pretty crazy, isn't it? The room full of mice fell silent, expectant, waiting. And as Despereaux stood before them with the red thread around his neck, and the 14 members of the Mouse Council perched on the bricks above him, 2 burly mice came forward. Black pieces of cloth covered their heads. There were slits for their eyes. We, said the bigger of the 2 mice, will escort you to the dungeon. Despereaux, Antoinette called out. Oh, my Despereaux! Despereaux looked out into the crowd of mice and saw his mother. She was easy to spot. In honor of her youngest mouse being sent to the dungeon, she had put on a tremendous amount of makeup. Each of the hooded mice put a paw on Despereaux's shoulder. It's time, said the one on the left, the first hood. Antoinette pushed her way through the crowd. He is my son, she said. I want to have a last word with my son. Despereaux looked at his mother. He concentrated on standing before her without trembling. He concentrated on not being a disappointment. Please, said Antoinette, what will happen to him? What will happen to my baby? Ma'am, said the first hood. His voice was deep and slow. You don't want to know. I want to know. He is my child, the child of my heart, the last of my mice babies. The hooded mice said nothing. Tell me, said Antoinette. The rats, said the first. The rats, said the second. Yes, we the rats. What of them? The rats will eat him, said the second hood. Ah, said Antoinette. Mon Dieu! At the thought of being eaten by rats, Despereaux forgot about being brave. He forgot about not being a disappointment. He felt himself heading into another faint, but his mother, who had an excellent sense of dramatic timing, beat him to it. She executed a beautiful, flawless swoon, landing right at Despereaux's feet. Now you've done it, said the first hood. It doesn't matter, said the second. Step over her. We have a job to do. Nobody's mother is going to stop us. To the dungeon. To the dungeon, repeated the first hood. But his voice, so deep and certain a moment ago, now shook a tiny bit. He put a paw on Despereaux and tugged him forward, and the two hoods and Despereaux stepped over Antoinette. The crowd parted. The mice began to chant, To the dungeon, to the dungeon, to the dungeon. The drumbeat continued, boom, 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 and Despereaux was led away. At the last moment, Antoinette came out of her faint and shouted one word to her child. That word, reader, was adieu. Do you know the definition of adieu? Don't bother with your dictionary, I will tell you. Adieu is the French word for farewell. Farewell is not the word that you would like to hear from your mother as you are being led to the dungeon by two oversized mice in black hoods. Words that you would like to hear are, Take me instead. I will go to the dungeon in my son's place. There is a great deal of comfort in those words. But, reader, there is no comfort in the word farewell, even if you say it in French. Farewell is a word that, in any language, is full of sorrow. It is a word that promises absolutely nothing. Do you agree with that, 5th grade, that farewell promises nothing? Because if you think about it, you could say, I will see you again, or this is not the end. But when you hear farewell, does that promise anything after the farewell? Not really. Chapter 13. Perfidy unlimited. Remember, that's the word that we looked up. Together, the three mice traveled down, down, down. The thread around Despereaux's neck was tight. He felt as if it was choking him. He tugged at it with one paw. Don't touch the thread, barked the second hood. Yeah, echoed the first hood. Don't touch the thread. They moved quickly, and whenever Despereaux slowed, one of the two hoods poked him in the shoulder and told him to keep moving. They went through holes in the wall and down golden stairs. They went past rooms with doors that were closed and doors that were flung wide. The three mice traveled from marble floors and under heavy velvet drapes. They moved through warm patches of sunlight and dark pools of shade. This, thought Despereaux, was the world he was leaving behind, the world that he knew and he loved. And somewhere in it, the Princess P was laughing and smiling and clapping her hands to music, unaware of Despereaux's fate, that he would not be able to let the princess know what had become of him seemed suddenly unbearable to the mouse. Would it be possible for me to have a last word with the princess? Despereaux asked. A word? Said the second hood. You want a word with a human? I want to tell her what has happened to me. Geez, said the first hood. He stopped and stamped upon the floor in frustration. Cripes, you can't learn, can you? The voice was terribly familiar to Despereaux. Furlough? He said. What? Said the first hood irritably. Despereaux shuddered. His own brother was delivering him to the dungeon. His heart stopped beating and shrunk to a small, cold, disbelieving pebble. But then, just as quickly, it leapt alive again, beating with hope. Furlough, Despereaux said, and he took one of his brother's paws in his own. Please let me go. Please, I'm your brother. Furlough rolled his eyes. He took his paw out of Despereaux's. No, he said. No way. Please, said Despereaux. No, said Furlough. Rules are rules. Reader, do you recall that word, perfidy? As our story progresses, perfidy becomes an even more appropriate word, doesn't it? Perfidy was certainly the word that was in Despereaux's mind as the mice finally approached the narrow, steep stairs that led to the black hole of the dungeon. They stood, the three mice, two with hoods and one without, and contemplated the abyss before them. And then Furlough stood up on his hind legs and placed his right paw over his heart. For the good of the castle mice, he announced to the darkness, we deliver this day to the dungeon a mouse in need of punishment. He is, according to the laws we have established, wearing the red thread of death. The red thread of death, repeated Despereaux in a small voice. Wearing the red thread of death was a terrible phrase, but the mouse didn't have long to consider its implications, because he was suddenly pushed from behind by the hooded mice. The push was a strong one, and it sent Despereaux flying down the stairs into the dungeon. As he tumbled, whisker over tail, through the darkness, there were only two words in his mind. One was perfidy, and the other word that he clung to was P. Perfidy P, perfidy P. These were the words that pinwheeled through Despereaux's mind as his body descended into the darkness. And on page 70, you can see Despereaux there between the two mice. Now, fifth grade, what do you think about Despereaux's father, Lester, being the one to call the council, tell the council about what his son has done? What do you think about Furlough telling on Despereaux in the first place, and now being the one to escort him to the dungeon? And even when given a chance by his to free his brother, after his brother pleaded for him to let him go, he said no. How do you think Despereaux's feeling right now? Probably pretty defeated, right? Well, let's read chapter 14, see what happens. Despereaux lay on his back at the bottom of the steps and touched the bones in his body one by one. They were all there, and amazingly, they were unbroken. He got to his feet and became aware of a terrible, foul, extremely insulting smell. The dungeon, reader, stank. It stank of despair and suffering and hopelessness, which is to say that the dungeon smelled of rats. And it was so dark. Despereaux had never before encountered darkness so awful, so all-encompassing. The darkness had a physical presence, as if it were a being, all in its own. The mouse held one small paw up in front of his whiskers. He could not see it, and he had the truly alarming thought that perhaps he, Despereaux Tilling, did not even exist. "Oh my!" he said out loud. His voice echoed in the smelly darkness. "Perfidy," said Despereaux, just to hear his own voice again, just to assure himself that he did exist. "P," said Despereaux, and the name of his beloved was immediately swallowed up by the darkness. He shivered, he shook, he sneezed. His teeth chattered. He longed for his handkerchief. He grabbed hold of his tail. It took him a long, frightening moment to even locate his tail, so absolute was the darkness. To have something, anything to hold on to. He considered fainting. He deemed it the only reasonable response to the situation in which he found himself, but then he remembered the words of the Threadmaster. Honor, courtesy, devotion, and bravery. I will be brave, thought Despereaux. I will try to be brave like a knight in shining armor. I will be brave for the Princess P. How best for him to be brave? He cleared his throat. He let go of his tail. He stood up straighter. Once upon a time, he said out loud to the darkness. He said these words because they were the best, the most powerful words that he knew, and just the saying of them comforted him. Once upon a time, he said again, feeling a tiny bit braver, there was a knight, and he wore always an armor of shining silver. Once upon a time, boomed a voice from the darkness, a knight in shining armor. What does a mouse know of such things? That voice, the loudest voice that Despereaux had ever heard, could only, he assumed, belong to the world's largest rat. Despereaux's small, overworked heart stopped beating, and for the second time that day, the mouse fainted. Goodness, poor Despereaux. He's been having quite a few surprises today, hasn't he? Well, we are going to stop there. I want you to think about where is that voice coming from and what's going to happen to Despereaux.